Hello, and welcome to the No More Global Dialogue series for August, Champions for Change, Working to Eradicate Gender-Based Violence. I'm Jane Randall. I'm the co-founder and the chair of No More. And at No More, we believe that each of us can be the change for good that we seek in the world. And our panelists today are certainly evidence of that. Before we begin, I do want to note that if anyone feels uncomfortable or needs help and support anytime during this conversation, please feel free to access the No More Global Directory or the Commonwealth Says No More directory to address gender-based violence, particularly within the Commonwealth. The global and regional leaders with us today are perfect examples proactively addressing the all too silent epidemic of violence against women and girls and making real change. This conversation coincides with the opening of the 13th Commonwealth Women's Affairs Ministers Meeting, which is being held in Nassau, the Bahamas, from the 21st to the 23rd of August, 2023, under the theme Equality Towards a Common Future. Hosted by the government of the Bahamas, the meeting serves as the principal decision-making body for the Commonwealth Women's Affairs Ministers to review progress made towards achieving 4 Commonwealth priorities for gender equity and women's empowerment. We know that globally, 1 in 3 women have experienced a form of domestic and sexual violence. We also know that domestic and sexual violence escalated and intensified during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that it's exacerbated by the current climate emergency, as well as in conflict zones and war. Today, we'll be discussing these and other important issues related to gender-based violence. So now I'm honored to introduce our panel. The Right Honorable Patricia Scotland, KC, Secretary General of the Commonwealth. The Secretary General serves the 56 governments and 2.4 billion people of the Commonwealth. Born in Dominica, she moved to the UK at an early age and was brought up in a large, close-knit Caribbean family where she was taught the importance of hard work, education, pride in her heritage, and the obligation to give back to the region of her birth and to the society in which she was raised. This ethic has guided her throughout her dynamic career in law, public service, and politics. A lawyer by profession, she became the first Black and youngest woman ever to be appointed Queen's Counsel. She is the only woman since the post was created in 1315 to be Attorney General for England and Wales, and was also Attorney General for Northern Ireland. Welcome, Secretary General. I'm also pleased to introduce the spouse of the Prime Minister of the Bahamas, Mrs. Anne Marie Davis. Mrs. Davis is a highly respected transformational leader and catalyst for change. She has dedicated her life to serving humanity, being a voice of hope, empowerment for many nationally and globally. As a revolutionary thinker and transformational leader, Mrs. Davis is known for her passion for gender equality, women's rights, youth empowerment, social reconstruction, community development, economic empowerment, and the eradication of cervical cancer. Her commitment as a campaigner for the empowerment and addressing national and international causes in alignment with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals has catapulted her onto global platforms. She is world-renowned for her selfless, genuine, down-to-earth love for people, unwavering commitment to help shatter glass ceilings, and her deep, intuitive understanding of the challenges faced by many individuals and how to bring solutions. Welcome, Mrs. Davis. And finally, it's a pleasure to introduce the First Lady of Sri Lanka, Professor Maitri Wickramasinghe. Professor Wickramasinghe is the chair and senior professor of English at the Department of English and the founding director of the Center for Gender Studies at the University of Kelaniya, Sri Lanka. She is also a visiting professor at the Center for Higher Education and Equity Research, University of Sussex, and a member of the Board of Trustees of the Asian University for Women in Bangladesh. She was recently invited to be a champion for Commonwealth Says No More, an initiative of the Commonwealth Secretariat and the No More Foundation. An expert on gender, she is a scholar whose work interfaces research, teaching and training, policy development, evaluation, advocacy, and activism. She counts almost 30 years of experience in formulating gender equity and equality policies and strategies, conducting gender responsive trainings and evaluating women's and gender programs for local and international organizations. Her publications cross a number of subjects and disciplines, from literary and critical theory to development, from sexual and gender-based violence to feminist research methodology, from higher education to disaster management and gender in the workplace. She has been a frequent keynote speaker for academic and professional organizations in Sri Lanka and worldwide. Welcome, Professor. Well, thank you all so much for being here. It is very, very exciting and such a pleasure to be able to have this dialogue. I want to start briefly to set the stage. Secretary General, we're going to begin with you. Can you share some background on the prevalence of domestic and sexual violence in the Commonwealth, and how and why addressing gender-based violence became such a priority for you and the Commonwealth?
Well, the first thing to say is, unfortunately, the Commonwealth is a reflection of the rest of the world. So according to the World Health Organization, it affects 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men. And so if you think that the Commonwealth is made up of 2.6 billion people, that's almost 1/3 of the world's population, and just about 50% of that 2.6 billion are female. And then you think about 1 in 3, it is a truly shocking statistic. It is the greatest cause of morbidity in women and girls, which basically means it kills and injures more women and girls than anything else. So more than COVID, more than cancer, more than anything else. And in itself, it is a silent pandemic, a breach of human rights, and it truly debilitates women. So because the Commonwealth has always been one of the most trenchant advocates for equality, for inclusivity, it was a scar on us all that this violence against women and girls was not being sufficiently concretely and collectively addressed, because every country in our Commonwealth had committed itself to end violence against women and girls, and every country was working hard on it. But the difference, I think, is we all believed that we could work harder if we worked together in partnership. And it's this partnership which has been so important. But what's really terrible about domestic violence is, and sexual violence, it represents and presents itself in a very similar way, irrespective of our cultures, our countries, our ages, our academic positions, our demographics in terms of economy. And that's what's terrible about it. What is good about it is all those same things, because if one of us can find the solution, then it helps all of us to find that solution together. And so that's why the Commonwealth is so committed to this issue, and that's why we launched Commonwealth Says No More, because we want to put an end to violence against women and girls, and end to sexual violence as well.
Wonderful. This is a question now for both of our First Ladies. What led you to champion ending domestic and sexual violence in your country? And can you share with us an example of something that has been a successful program, initiative, something that has made an impact or is starting to make an impact? Starting with you, Professor Wickramasinghe.
Yes. I must say I'm new to the job, because it's only within the last couple of months that the Secretary General has very kindly invited me to become a champion. So therefore, I'm new on the job, but the point being that in my career, although I'm the chair of the Department of English at my university, I have focused on women, gender, and feminist studies, and that has been for about 33 or so years. So it's almost natural that I would kind of get to work on sexual and gender-based violence. And as a young researcher, I remember being asked to interview women who had been sexually harassed about 33 years ago. And I was extremely surprised that I could identify respondents so easily. and being startled by the fact that of the 25 qualitative interviews that I conducted, many women, all the women had been sexually harassed, and more women have been harassed more than thrice during the course of their lives. So I think that kind of prompted my interest, particularly in gender-based and sexual-based violence.
Mrs. Davis? Same question. I can repeat it if you'd like. What led you to become a champion ending domestic and sexual violence? And is there anything, a successful initiative or some program that you're beginning that you wanted to point to?
Yes, I, for about 10 or 12 years, I have been looking closer and closer at the trends in violence against women, especially domestic violence. And I've been seeing its effects on our society, how it damages the psyche of women. It makes them, it puts them in a place where they don't want to, they feel violated, they don't want to participate, they don't want to go to school, they think that they're locked in a situation, they're hopeless. And so the situation I noticed was getting worse. For example, some statistics I have here, and right now, in the first 5 months of 2023, we have sexual violence rapes have gone up 64% over last year. 25% of the murders due to domestic violence occurs here in the Bahamas, out of the entire region, the entire Caribbean region. And we only have a population of about 400,000. In 2021, we had like 3,283 reported incidents of domestic violence. Some resulted in murders, some resulted in attempted murders, assaults with deadly weapons, stabbings, and even shootings. These are horrific. And it just hurts so much to know that this is what we are going through and not much was happening. So I entered the fight to end this type of behavior, violence, gender-based as we call it, but domestic violence, as we put it here, mostly. And in many cases, more than 1,000 of the abused cases end up in our crisis center. And it takes so much to look after these cases. Some women never recover. Some go back into the situation because they cannot do better. And so I entered the fight to help with safe houses, programs that will uplift women, empower women. So this is where my focus has been. As for one of the cases that I championed recently, last year, we had, was it last year? We had the suicide of a young woman called Carissa. I took up this case personally and spoke out vociferously against it at her candlelight vigil. She committed suicide because at that time, the information that we had before all the investigations were being done was that this young lady was ignored several times when she made her complaints to the police about being beaten, assaulted, because they thought she sounded crazy. She had a son, 2 years old. She reported the incident again. She was put in a safe house. Her abuser was put in ankle bracelets. While in this safe house, she was bullied and harassed by her abuser. He was not monitored by the police as to his whereabouts and what he was doing. She kept pleading for help, saying that she was harassed and bullied, she couldn't sleep, and she was a mess. Eventually, she ended up committing suicide in front of her 2-year-old child. That upset me so much that I went to her candlelight vigil and put a bashing on the police force for ignoring this young woman from the time of her reporting the incident to the time of her death, because the perpetrator wasn't being monitored. No one listened to her. The man was just laughing and boasting that he was doing whatever he wanted. No one helped her. There was no follow-up on her case. And so all these things I brought to light in very strong terms. It was widespread in the news and the print media. And so we, up to now, right now, because of that, the Commissioner of Police had undertook to separate a special victims unit for women, separated from the entire police station so we can have more focus on these types of issues affecting young women. So right now, we have identified a building. We are separating the domestic violence unit from the big unit where we would have resources and different personnel allocated to just these cases. So I am very proud that I have started this movement or caused this to happen. That is one way that I would like to say that I made a difference here in this country.
That's fabulous. That's wonderful to hear. She was lucky.
Thank you.
She was unlucky, but very lucky to have you as an advocate for her and for other women like her.
Yes.
Just staying with you for a minute, what do you think are the challenges that your country particularly faces? Perhaps different from others, perhaps same.
Yes, there are a few that I could mention here. One of them is violence within the family in some of our family islands. We are an archipelagic nation. We have at least 30 countries, 30 islands at least inhabited. And that makes it very difficult to keep track of everything that's happening on every island, to gather information and everything else, and also treat abused victims. And information gathering is a problem. Because of that, violence within the family, particularly against women and children, is like an open secret that happens in some of these family islands. And it's been like that for so many years. So we need a cultural shift totally to help eradicate this program. It has to be seriously addressed, which is what we're doing in our new bill. That's one of our challenges because of all the islands we inhabit. We have a rape culture here in the Bahamas. It's so prevalent now that everyone says, oh, someone got raped again. And that's the end of it. That's the end of the conversation. So we're trying to sensitize people that you just don't say, it's like if it's acceptable that someone is raped so prevalently, and that is something, a challenge that we have to fight. Another thing is we've wanted our own sexual victims court so we can have trials quicker than before. I personally have been advocating for this for the last 6 years. Last month, our Chief Justice made an announcement that he will be allocating at least 2 or 3 spaces for sexual abuse court. So we will have our own court for our gender-based violence victims. That's one of the challenges we had. So until that is done, that challenge will still stay, because we need swifter justice. We need trial dates to be closer to the incident when it happens, so that women wouldn't see their attackers walking the street out on bail, awaiting trial. All these things happen. We have a challenge of breaking the silence, because people are still feeling stigmatized when they're raped or mental illness. They still think it's a stigma and they don't want to talk about it. So we're working very hard on breaking the silence in these issues, to seek psychiatric help when it's needed, because treatment is available for that. And victim blaming. People like to say, well, oh, I think she's to blame. If she wasn't there, that would not have happened. So we're working very hard to stop victim blaming by improving our new bill. I could stop right there with those challenges.
That's plenty of challenges. Professor, you have worked in gender equity, gender policy, and now we're getting engaged in this issue. What are some of the challenges that you see in Sri Lanka?
In Sri Lanka, I would say one of the biggest challenge is people's mindsets. And I don't mean the mindsets of the abusers alone. I'm talking about society that refuses to take the phenomenon seriously. I'm talking about victims and survivors who are compelled to stay in relationships for various reasons, whether it's economic or familial or insecurity or whatever it is, and stay on until violence sometimes escalates into femicide. Neighbors who refuse to intervene even when they hear these beatings take place. I'm talking about family members who side with the perpetrators just because they are part of family and extended family. Medical personnel who gossip and sensationalize wounds and so on, and the police who are sometimes discourage the targeted women from making statements and just end up advising them to go home and to make up with their husbands and look after their children. So, you know, you see these resonates with a lot of other countries as well. In Sri Lanka in particular, another major problem when it comes particularly to legal redress is the delay in the court system. Sometimes court cases take as long as 20 years, and I'm not exaggerating, to reach a conclusion, and where victims and survivors kind of are delayed justice due to the attrition in our system. Young girls who have been abused are often married by the time the judicial processes conclude. So the chasm between cases of abuse being reported and perpetrators being taken to court and perhaps even found guilty is huge. And even there, it's only about 2% of people who are prosecuted that are actually found guilty. I mean, it's the gap between the people who report cases, and it's only about 2% of that where you have a satisfactory conclusion, where you feel that justice has been done.
Right.
So I would want to highlight those two as the main challenges that we are facing. Obviously, there are many more challenges.
Right. Thank you. Secretary General, these are not new challenges. You've been doing this work for a long time. And so you know that these are the things that people face all the time. We've heard you talk about the whole system approach. So could you explain this as part of your work in the Commonwealth? And you may want to unmute.
Yes, in one sense, it's heartbreaking to hear what we've heard just now, because it is such a familiar story. And everyone listening to this in almost whichever country they come from will hear the echo in their own countries and their own country's experience. That's why I said earlier, one of the terrible things about this type of violence is that it is pervasive and repeats itself in a similar way. One of the good things about it is that it repeats itself in the same way, because what we are finding are ways through. So as many of you will know, in 1997, I became a member of the House of Lords, and in 1999, I became a minister. And we started with, in the Foreign Office, dealing with things like international child abduction and forced marriage. But then when I became the minister in the Home Office, deputy to the Home Secretary, we looked at the level of violence in our society. We looked at crime. And we found that in the United Kingdom, 25% of all violent crime was domestic in nature. And that we had about 120 deaths per year. So we were seeing 2 or 3 women die every single week. But it was affecting between 750 and 950,000 children. And their ability to thrive was materially impacted. And we then looked at every single Department of State, and most of us were doing something. We looked at local authorities. They were doing something. We looked at businesses. They were not necessarily engaged, but we saw that so much of the violence actually happened while the people were at work. Then we looked at the foundations, and then we looked at the individuals, and everybody was working really hard, but they were all working in silos. And then when we started to look at these different elements from the victim's point of view, we asked a question. What would we have had to do to make it possible for you to step out of the situation? What would it have needed to help you to be able to speak? Because we've heard silence is a huge issue, because the perpetrator will tend to say to the victim, this is your fault. You've created this. You've made me do this. Your family know I'm a fabulous person. You were lucky to have me. And now you will behave yourself. And this common theme was there. So we had to break the silence, but we also had to educate all the individual institutions and organizations to understand what they were seeing, because most people didn't see the nature of domestic violence. They didn't realize it was part of a theme that would grow and grow, and they didn't understand the nature of it and how to recognize the elements. So I was made the minister who was responsible for chairing an interministerial group on domestic violence. And we came to realize that it would take all of us, because every single one of us had an opportunity. And the first thing we did is we looked at the economic cost of domestic violence. The economic cost then in the United Kingdom was £23 billion a year. And we disaggregated that 23 billion. So we understood how much for public sector, for government, how much for local government, how much for business, how much for pain, injury, loss and suffering. And we realized that it would take all of us to change the system. So we looked at what that actually meant. For businesses, it was £2.7 billion worth of economic cost coming straight off their bottom line. So we had to look at what could they do? How could they interdict it? Then we looked at governments. We understood that if you looked at it from the victim's point of view, we all had an element of opportunity to help them, but we weren't conjoined. So we created the multi-agency risk assessment conference, because sometimes when we were looking at these cases, it would take maybe 3-4 hours, but the victim didn't have 3-4 hours for us to respond. And so what we did is we came together and said, let's look at what a high risk case looks like and what a medium risk looks like and what a low risk. And a high risk case was a case where the person may end up being killed or seriously injured. And we thought if we could identify the common features in all the cases which had ended up in domestic violence and then death or senior injury, we would be able to intervene on those cases and stop the deaths. And that's what we did. And we went to every agency and we said to them, what is a high risk case for you? And then we amalgamated and identified all the common features. So instead of a case conference taking 3 or 4 hours, we could do it within 15 minutes because we had all already committed. Firstly, what did a high risk case look like? Secondly, what would we do in order to help to intervene and make it better? And 3, how could we do it quickly? And this joined up holistic approach really enabled us to make a difference. So by the time I left government, we had gone from 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men to 1 in 6 women and 1 in 10 men. We'd reduced domestic violence by 64%, and we had saved about £7.1 billion per year in economic cost. So what we are doing in the Commonwealth is we're pooling all the good knowledge that we have from all of our countries, all the things that worked, all the things that didn't work. And it's really important that we should share the things that do not work, because all of us have tried it. You know, we've got the T-shirt and the video, and we've got the soundtrack. And if we can share what does not work, we can accelerate the opportunities to do what does work better, cheaper, and easier. And so that's where Commonwealth Says No More really came from, so that we could pull together this holistic, multidisciplinary approach, and to understand that it takes all of us. I mean, we trained doctors, nurses, locksmiths, taxi drivers, teachers, dinner ladies, everybody, because what we did is we looked at, to whom do you talk? And that's why we had to try and educate our friends. Because if it's 1 in 3 women in the world, if you look at it, there are 4 women on this call. We probably know someone who this is happening to. And if we don't know how to recognize the signs, we will be complicit in their silence. But if we are informed, we're able to support women, because we know that a woman can be injured 39 times on average before she has the courage to come forward. That means some women come forward straight away. The first time they come forward, but some of them, some of the women are injured or assaulted hundreds of times before they come forward. So we know that this whole system, which you could translate into say, it will take all of us, is the only way that works. And we have the empirical data from the work we did when I was in government to show not only does it work, but that it is very successful, but is absolutely dependent on partnership.
Right.
And so that's why it's so wonderful. And I want to really thank both of our first ladies, because we need advocates. We need champions. We need people with the courage to say, look, this is okay for us to talk about. And you don't have to sweep it under the carpet, and you're not on your own. And we need to get our men involved too. Because I am the daughter of the most fantastic feminist you've ever met. In fact, 2 feminists, because one of them happened to be my father. And I have 7 brothers who I adore. And these men are wonderful men who would absolutely be distraught if any woman they cared about, whether it was a friend, a sister, a daughter, a mother, if they were to be hurt by someone they considered a Neanderthal, they would be up in arms. And so we need to galvanize all people of goodwill, both our wonderful men and our wonderful women, to work together to end this scourge. And it will take all of us, and we have to have a whole systems approach. It's everybody's business. Right. It's not one of our businesses, every single person's business to stop this. And we can.
Agreed. Thank you. I want to be respectful of the time in Sri Lanka. So I want to ask Professor a question. And then I definitely want to come back to you, Secretary General, to ask about the intersection with climate change and climate emergency and the other conflict and how that impacts domestic and sexual violence. But let me hold that for a second. Professor, thinking about what you knew coming into this call, thinking about what you've heard just now from both Mrs. Davis and the Secretary General, wondering what you want those who are listening to take away, based on what you know is happening in your country and what you've heard? What do you think that those who are listening can really take away?
I think we all have to realize that we are entitled to live a life that is free of violence, number one. Well, I have come across women who have felt that it is their lot in life to be violated, and that men are naturally aggressive, and that these situations cannot be changed. And in turn, the aggressors and the societies also feel the same way. And it is this sense of vulnerability and disempowerment that we need to address with zero tolerance. Of course, as the Secretary General has pointed out, we're dealing with a multifaceted phenomenon, and that requires multifaceted, integrated, and intersecting approaches. And in a recent research study that we conducted on femicides, it involved not only looking at the premature deaths of women, but also the interpersonal relationships with the killers, almost all of them men, the surviving families of women, and the social repercussions on children and so on. The judicial process and how the case went through the police investigation and how it went through the courts, and also how the media portrayed these killings. And in that sense, we kind of had a very kind of a holistic approach to the issue. But of course, we are talking about the many dimensions of the problem, and I would just want to list it for us to keep our minds on that. It's a gender problem: sexual, physical, psychological, medical, forensic, criminal, legal. It's judicial, economic, cultural, political, social media, interpersonal, ethnic, religious, generational, neurodiversity, etc., etc. All these are involved. And to that extent, then we need to recognize the many dimensions when we are dealing with the problem. Perhaps I might also want to say that earlier on, when you asked me about something that we had done, which was successful, and I would like to say that there is an online reporting mechanism that we established within the Sri Lankan state university system to report instances of violence, ragging particularly, because that is a practice that we have in our universities, where freshers into the universities are ragged by the seniors, and this ragging can be extremely violent sometimes. And that online mechanism allows people to even report violence anonymously.
Mrs. Davis, a similar question, listening now to what the professor has said and what the Secretary General has said, and knowing what you knew coming in, and what do you want the people who are watching to take away?
Yes, I'd like them to know how serious this situation is. This is our world that we live in, and we have to end this global scourge. Humanity has to be better off. We have to fight gender-based violence in all its forms. And not just first ladies, but young people. We have to educate NGOs and everyone else, civic organizations, companies, media organizations, to know that they have an impact of how a population thinks and views men and women, and especially young organizations. We want the youth to know, and we want people to know in general, that the long-term effects from physical and sexual violence, they have mental consequences, and they negatively affect women and how they act in a society. Rape and sexual assault can result in unwanted pregnancies, complications during birth, STDs such as HIV, which we here in the Caribbean have been fighting very much against. And to education to know the damages that are done from these types of acts. And there's so much right now that the youth can do to curb what is happening in violence in the arena of domestic violence. For example, they can interrupt discriminatory messages that are going on social media. They can report messages and photos that exploit women and girls. If they see abuse happening or rape, they could interrupt. I mean, to, of course, use their senses, but at least say something or report it. They could stop sexual harassment. They could fight against it. They could start thinking about how they view women and girls so that we can end this rape culture that we have here in the Bahamas and elsewhere. Stop the victim blaming, stop stereotyping women and their roles in this life, be mentors. There's just so much that we can do. So we have to start looking at ourselves and what role we can play to end gender-based violence, domestic violence. We have to have a healthy society, community, nation, and world going forward. And we must do our part. And all of us must be in this fight to end gender-based violence. That's what I think I want everyone to go away with, that they all have a part to play. Everyone does. They can choose, they can examine themselves, have conversations in groups or wherever, and decide how they will take on this fight. So that's what I would like everyone to remember after this.
Great, great message. Secretary General, I wanted to ask you, I know that one of your goals has been reaching marginalized and vulnerable communities. And I also know that we are all too aware of the intersectionality of domestic violence with the climate crisis, the climate emergency. So wanted to get your thoughts about sort of all those things together, because we all know from research, we've seen it, that when there is conflict, when there is disruption, these issues spike, they go up. We saw it with COVID-19, you see it in war-torn regions, and now you can see it during climate emergency. Just, can you comment on that a bit?
I think one of the saddest things is that you see at any emergency, women and young people suffer the most. If you look at every single sustainable development goal, you'll find that the group most disadvantaged in each of those, from 1 to 16, women and children feature. And one of the things that's been really heartbreaking is when you look at the climate crisis that we are now facing, and it's real, because we have had probably about an increase in 7,000 climate crises since the year 2000. The cost in life terms, the number of people killed, has gone up probably 75–80%, and the cost financially has gone up. And when you ask yourself, who is most affected financially when there is a climate crisis or a global collapse? It is women. Women tend to be in the informal economy, and it's their jobs that go first. When a climate crisis happens, they tend to be those most likely to be forgotten and to suffer the most. So this intersectionality, which the professor has rightly identified, reminded us of the multiple different ways in which women can be subjugated. And it's not just physical, it's emotional, it's financial, it's all those different ways. When a crisis happens, that all gets exacerbated. And so we've had to be really clear that this issue of violence against women and girls has to be looked at through the lens, that multi-dimensional lens, because the impact on women is also multidimensional. And the tragedy is it's layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. And that's why we come back to say it's a multidimensional issue which needs a multidimensional holistic response. And once we start to weave it all in, you start to see how you can cure it. And the thing that I am incredibly enthused by, grateful for, is that in the past, people were saying things like, and we've heard it from the professor, look, this is part of our culture. This is just part of the world. This can never be changed. It's part of human nature. And what we know is that's a lie. It can be changed. We can change the culture. We can change the paradigm in which women and girls sit. But we have to choose to do it. And we have to be focused. And we have to work together. And we've got to make sure that we don't leave anyone behind. And if you want to look at those women who are most disadvantaged, they'd be women who are disabled in some way, women who suffer that disability, women who are older, women who have other vulnerabilities. They end up being even more vulnerable. So I think the thing that I am happiest about is that in coming together, in working on this program, Commonwealth Says No More, and all countries putting their shoulder to the wheel, sharing what their experience has been, has made it possible for us to go much more quickly than we would have been able to.
Right.
And we also know, unfortunately, from the empirical data, that if we don't adopt this whole systems approach, even when we succeed to make that difference, we will go backwards, because in many of the countries where the holistic approach had been adopted and then changed, we look at the figures. And one of the tragedies is that if you look at the figures in the United Kingdom, we might have been 1 in 6 women and 1 in 10 men, but as I understand it, we are between 2.5 and 3. So 1 in 3 women or 1 in 2.5. So within 13 years, we have gone backwards.
Right.
And so we know what we need to do to make sure that it's a forward-leaning approach. And I am so thrilled that in our Commonwealth, every single country, every single leader has said no more, and that they've understood that they can be the difference we need to see in this world. The political will, backed up with positive action, can move this agenda forward. I created a charity a number of years ago, which is probably no more, saying the Global Foundation for the Elimination of Domestic Violence. And people said, well, that's rather bold, that's rather brave, you know, but global. And I said, well, which part of the world is it going to be okay for there to be domestic violence? And okay, we'll give you global, but elimination? And I then said, so how much violence against women and girls is okay? And they went, oh, so we want to eliminate domestic and sexual violence from our world. Because if we do that, it'll benefit not just the women and girls, but our men also. We'll have a safer world, a better world. We've said that there cannot be peace in our world until we have peace in our homes. So this Peace in Our Home initiative, through what we will do as a Commonwealth family, I hope we will be the pathfinders for all of us globally, because we represent 1/3 of the world. And if we in the Commonwealth can deliver this, then there'll really be hope for everybody else. And I'm so thrilled when I see the passion in our 56 leaders and the wonderful way in which all the first ladies and first men are stepping up to help make this difference. And I just want to say we can do this. We are doing this. And I am profoundly grateful, profoundly grateful.
Thank you. Yes, it has been a true, I have one last question for you, Secretary General, but it has been a true honor for me to be sitting here with the three of you. You know, it's just incredible to see the dedication and the work on an issue that has been important to me for 20 plus years and has impacted so many people in my life and others. You gave us, Secretary General, a pretty good wrap up just there, but I wanted to just say, you know, some of the people watching may not know what, you know, one little thing that they can do to start to get engaged in No More, in this work, you know, bring it to their communities. Do you have, you know, one little piece of advice, your one thing that you'd want someone, we can end with, that wants someone who can take away?
I would say that the one thing you can do is to hear, listen, and see. Because when I asked, and I became a lawyer when I was 21. So for many, many years, I had the privilege of representing those who had suffered abuse of this nature. And when I asked them, what would you really have liked someone to do? They said, if just one person, when they asked me, how are you? If they'd actually looked into my eyes and listened and waited for an answer without passing me by. So I would say, if you're worried about someone, if you think they're being quiet and they've changed and you don't know why, just take a minute, look them in the eye and say, how are you? And then hang around and make sure you get an answer, because that's sometimes all it takes to save a life.
Yep.
And it's worth it.
For
and
sure.
The second thing, if I could have it, was join No More.
Well, of course you can say that. So, well, I want to thank all of you, each of you, for your time. You could be doing other things, and you're, especially Professor, it's so late there. Really, really appreciate your taking the time to have this conversation with me, but also to share it with all the people that are going to be watching and will really learn and benefit from it. So thank you very, very much.